Sunny. Good evening, everybody. As she was giving that introduction, I realized, you know, I do know more whales than I do know people. And but that's partially because I spend hours just staring at the whales without any sort of embarrassment. If I stared at all of you with the same level of detail, we'd all feel uncomfortable. So I've been working with right whales for 25 years, as have a number of my colleagues. I'm really fortunate to work with an amazing team of people here at the aquarium. Although I'm giving this talk, there are a number of us who study right whales here. And we all have been drawn into this world of right whale research and held in a way that many other whale species don't hold us. And the aquarium actually has done a lot of the pioneering work with right whales. We were the first to survey 2 of the primary habitats for right whales. We're the catalog holders for all the photographs in the North Atlantic. We're doing really cutting-edge work, working with industry. There's a lot of problems with shipping and fishing gear entanglements, which I'll be telling you about. And our team has been working directly with the industry to try to figure out ways to mitigate that. So it's an amazing group of people to work with. Another cutting-edge thing that we're doing here is looking at right whale health. Starting out initially just looking at photographs of whales and assessing their health from the photographs, but it's gotten increasingly sophisticated, and now looking at the feces of whales, and potentially this year we're going to try collecting blows from whales to look at hormone levels, stress levels, things like that. So it's a wonderful group of people to work with. I think, you know, Sunny really said it right, that it's knowing the individuals that is so compelling. There are only about 450 left. And when you study anything, you're collecting data. So we collect data. But in our case, those data are individuals which we know. We know their mother, their grandmother, who their father is in some cases. So it makes it a very personal and much more interesting story than any other sort of research. And that's what's kept me compelled for a long time. So just to give you, first I should actually describe right whales. I'm going to give another description, but they're very odd beasts. This is an animal's head. It's going from the left to the right, and this is the lower jaw, and this is the upper jaw. And you'll see diagrams of this, and I'll keep pointing them out. They're hard to imagine what you're seeing when you look at right whales. For the talk tonight, I'm going to start off with just a brief history, because they have a very interesting one and a somewhat tragic one. Do a quick overview of the current status and threats of the population, and then go into how we actually identify the individual, since that's sort of the meat and potatoes of what we do and the base of the stories I'm going to tell. What I thought that would be an interesting way to structure this talk is actually use the whales, let the whales tell you what's happening. So it's going to be 10 stories. The first 5 give you an indication of what we know, what we've learned from them. And then the second 5, which are a little bit more interesting to me, are when the whales show us how little we know. And that happens more and more. And it's exciting, because that shows us there's a lot yet to do and know. And then finally, I'm just going to cover a few of the really intriguing behaviors that we've been witnessing for years. And sometimes we think we know what's happening, and then all of a sudden we get additional data which shows that we don't understand the whole picture. So to start off with right whales, they're easily distinguished from other whale species. They're all black. They have this callosity tissue, which is cornified skin that erupts on the top of the head and along the margins of the lip. I'll be telling you more about that in a minute, but they're the only ones that have callosity tissue. They're also the only ones that have a V-shaped blow. All the baleen whales have 2 blowholes, whereas the toothed whales just have a single one. And in the case of the right whales, those blowholes are oriented in such a way that you get a V-shaped pattern, which is very distinctive. They're all black, except for some have a white pattern on the underside of them, on their chin or their belly. They don't have a dorsal fin, which is quite unusual. And lastly, they have very distinctive tails. Many people know about humpback whale tails and know that you identify humpbacks by the underside of the pattern. That's not the case with right whales. Their tails are all black, very smooth, with a smooth margin, and they do lift them most of the times when they dive. I mentioned that there were only about 450 right whales left in the North Atlantic. They've been protected since 1935 from intentional hunting, but unfortunately we continue to sort of quote-unquote hunt them with our ships and our fishing gear. Right whales were initially hunted by the 11th century. The Basques were rowing off the shores of Spain and that area, and right whales actually got their name because they were the right whale to hunt back then. Partially because they were so coastal, they were within rowboat range. Also, they float when they're killed, so they could just tow them to shore to flens them. And they floated because they have a very thick layer of blubber, and that blubber can be rendered into oil, which made them very profitable. And lastly, the other thing that made them profitable was their baleen. Some whales have teeth, right whales have baleen. This is a filtering mechanism to filter out plankton from the water. This is a whale that's swimming from that side to that side. These are plates of baleen that hang from the upper jaw, and they're on the inside of those plates of baleen. It's all frayed and becomes this hairy mat. So imagine water and plankton going in through the front of this mouth. The water goes out through the sides, through the baleen, and all the plankton, the floating animals, are held on that hairy, fringy mat, and then they can swallow those. The baleen back then was used much in the same way that plastics are used today. They were used to make stays for women's corsets, handles to buggy whips, things like that. Right whales were originally found in the North Atlantic both on the eastern side and on the western side, but the eastern population was the one that was heavily hunted in the beginning, and then eventually, once they were pretty much wiped out, people started coming over to the western side. Now right whales are pretty much found just along the east coast of North America. There are 5 main areas of study, even though they're spread out throughout. They're seen in other areas, but the 5 focal areas is the southeast U.S. down here. This is where right whales are seen from December through March, roughly, and it's mostly mothers giving birth to calves. It's the primary, we used to think the only calving ground, but there may be some oddballs that calve elsewhere. So they're seen down here during the winter months. Then they make their way up. You'll see whales in Cape Cod Bay and Great South Channel off of Massachusetts in the late winter and spring. And then they'll make their way further north to the Bay of Fundy and Roseway Basin off of Maine and Nova Scotia, where they'll feed in the summer and fall. I mentioned that shipping and fishing is a real issue for this population. Unfortunately, right whales get hit at an alarming rate. It's hard to see because it's a scan of a slide, but this is a right whale basically sleeping in front of an oncoming ship. And we watched this event happen. We tried raising the ship on the radio. They weren't on that frequency, or for whatever reason, they didn't respond. And luckily, the whale was just off to the side, and we saw the bow wake wash over its head, and it sort of woke up, and it did not get hit. But that was just luck. Part of the problem is that people think, well, you know, ships are so noisy. Why didn't that whale hear it and get out of the way? One of the problems is that the engine and the propeller are all the way back, 600, 1,000 feet behind this wall of steel. And it's actually the quietest place is directly in front of a ship, which is unfortunate. So right whales get hit. This is propeller gashes in a 2-year-old male down off the coast of Florida. Was likely killed instantly. There have been 30 known fatalities from ship strikes, which is 32% of the population, 32% of the known mortalities. Occasionally, right whales can survive these strikes. This is a 6-year-old female that has the remainders from the scars of a ship strike. She may do fine. She's done fine now for several years. We're still concerned. We had one whale who was born down off of Florida, had 2 deep gashes in her side when she was just a couple months old. And those healed very well. She went on, she was living a healthy life. And then she got pregnant. And as she increased in girth due to the pregnancy, it actually opened up the wounds and killed her. So it's a problem. And just so you know, the beginning of this talk is a little heavy on the sad side. It'll pick up a little bit. And this is the goriest of the slides, really. This is a whale that died from an entanglement in fishing gear. You can see line wrapped thick around its flipper. That's its right flipper. It's cutting over the back, going over the other flipper. It was kind of hog-tied, and also coming out of the mouth. Whales get entangled in fishing gear at a really alarming rate. There have been only 14 known fatalities, which is another 15% of the known mortality. So that's, right there, that's 50% of all mortalities we know are caused by us. And we think it's actually much higher. One of the reasons we think it's higher is that these whales, when they get entangled in fishing gear, they'll carry that for a long time, and they often will get sick or weakened, not be able to feed, and then eventually they'll die from that, and their bodies won't be recovered. They'll sink, whereas right whales normally will float. So we think that the mortalities are probably underreported. This is an old slide, but this was a lucky whale. This is a whale named Trident, who had line going through his mouth for many, many years. But this was back in the 80s, and eventually those lines wore away, and he was free, and he's still swimming around out there. Unfortunately, my colleague Amy Knowlton, who's in the office, she's been working on the entanglement issue, and she's documented how over the years, fishing gear, the lines have gotten much, much stronger. And now they call things like polysteel because they're as strong as steel. So you don't see lines wear off. Occasionally whales are able to free themselves, but it's not due to the erosion of the line. Many of the whales we never actually see with the entangling gear in them. We just see the scars. This is a deep scar from an entanglement through the mouth. And actually, over 78% of the whales swimming around out there have scars from previous entanglements. And some of them have been tangled many times, 5 or 6 times. So it's a real problem. There are lots of other issues that right whales face, which I'm not going to go into, but just to mention them. We know that they're exposed to red tide events. There's parasites, toxins. There's changes in food distribution, which may be due to global warming, things that change the patterns of the ocean currents, and then make the plankton set up in different places where the whales aren't. So there's some indication that some years they have trouble finding food. And we think that sound pollution may be an increasing problem. A researcher from Cornell University recently did an assessment and thinks that the acoustic range for a right whale has been decreased by 80% in the past 50 years. So if you were trying to find your mate 10 miles away before, now you can only find it 2 miles away. But what I really want to go into now is the stories that these whales tell us. And to do that, you first have to know how we know these stories. So this callosity tissue, which I told you about, is unique to each individual. It's like a fingerprint, and it's like the underside of a humpback whale's tail, for those of you who are familiar with that. This is a whale that's spy hopping. This is the upper jaw, and this is the lower jaw wrapping around. Now, the callosity tissue is actually dark. Like this is a good example of the callosity tissue, and you see little patches of it. It's infested with these white creatures, cyamids, which are also known as whale lice. And we think that they feed off of the skin. They do the whales no harm and may actually benefit them because in some places where there are wounds on a whale, you'll see those cyamids go and infest it and clean it out. So it might be, can't really have a scab in the water, so this might be the marine version of it. And they help us because they highlight that callosity pattern. A dark callosity on top of a black-headed whale, it's pretty hard to see. The other thing that unfortunately help us is the entanglement scars, or scars from other causes. So many of the whales have those. That's an additional clue that help us discern one individual from another. And because they're kind of hard to understand what you're seeing with a right whale, I included this slide. These are photographs of 2 individuals, Admiral and 1233. And these are diagrams showing what we use to identify them. So you can see the difference in the callosity pattern between these two. Very distinctive. One has a continuous callosity, meaning it runs uninterrupted from the blowholes forward to the tip of the rostrum, whereas this has blank patches or a broken callosity. The eyes are down here, very deep in the water. So normally when you see a right whale swimming, you're not going to see the eye. It'll be 10 feet below the water surface. Eyebrow callosities, little patches of callosity along the margins of the mandibles. And all of those are used to distinguish one individual from another. In the old days, back when I started doing this, it was all done with slides and some with print film. And we didn't know any better, so it was fine. But leaning over a hot table with a tiny little jeweler's loop, you couldn't use your little zoom feature on your computer screen. You're really going blind trying to find the tiniest little scars to discern the whales. Luckily, we discovered digital photography, and it was very exciting, but it was a little awkward because we had a really good system for what to do with all these slides and how to move the data around and stuff. And we're like, well, what do you do with this? So luckily, I got a grant from the National Science Foundation to sort this problem out, and the result was DIGITS, which is Digital Image Gathering and Information Tracking System. It's to process all of our data and images. And this is just one screen that we use. This is a sighting of one whale, who we don't know who it is yet, taken on this date in 2008. And then we do a search down here and ask to see animals that have similar features, looking at the callosities and the scars. We put all those into a search, and up will come comparable images of different whales. And we can say, oh, okay, this sighting over here on the left, we know now is a sighting of 1611, and that's a whale that was born in 1986 and gave birth in 1996, and it all starts to fall together. And so that's really the base of what we do. It's a lot of minutia. Looking at, we get 3,000 to 5,000 sightings of right whales collected all along the eastern seaboard. We do a lot of the collecting here at the aquarium, but there's a huge group of people who also do this work, and it's very collaborative. So all those images come to us, and we just look at them over and over and over again and start to piece together these whales' lives. Another benefit of switching to this whole digital realm, now all of our data are served up on a server. We can access it from anywhere in the world, but we also now have a web presence. The entire catalog is searchable at this website. And that's, saving animals is a many-pronged thing, but one of the things is making sure that people know what the animal is and that it has a problem. And when many of us started doing right whale work, you'd say, I work with right whales, and just this blank look, and occasionally someone would, oh, white whales, and I said, no, not that. So, and then they'd sort of embarrassed. It was an awkward moment. So now right whales are better known, unfortunately, because of their plight, being entangled a lot. You hear about them in the news. Some of you may have been hearing about them recently. In good news, there are a lot of them seen off the Cape right now. This presence on the web makes them a lot more accessible to student groups and other researchers. So all this work basically ends up with a very large database. There are 55,000 records of 620 whales from 1935 to the present. Only 440 of those whales do we think are alive at the moment. Again, a huge collaboration amongst many research groups. And the result is a very detailed picture of many of these animals. We see them, many months throughout the year, going from habitat to habitat. We see so many of them so regularly that if we don't see them in 6 years, we can assume fairly accurately that they've died. This is kind of a boring slide, but it's exciting to me because what it says is if you see a whale 1 year, how long is it before you see that whale again? And you'll see that the majority, 90% of those gaps in the catalog are just 1 year or 2 years. So you're seeing these whales every year or every other year. And those animals we feel like we have a pretty good handle on. And I love telling people that about 10 years into doing this work, I really felt like we really knew what we were doing. I was very cocky. It's like, we see these whales over and over again. We basically have everybody counted. We got it wired. And the more you do anything and look at it in detail, then you start seeing some things that don't quite fit your knowledge, and you go, maybe we should look at this again. These are some of the animals that make you think that. These are whales this is a whale that went 17 years without being sighted, but then was sighted again. So our assumption that that whale was dead was obviously incorrect. And I actually did these numbers back a few years ago for The Urban Whale, which is a book that we produce with colleagues here at the aquarium. And since then, there have been a few more interesting gaps. We had a calving female who disappeared for 22 years, another calving female that disappeared for 16, and an adult male who disappeared for 18. So those are the lovely mysteries that I enjoy, and I'll be talking about them throughout this talk. So what do we get from this database? Well, one really basic thing. The red dots are all the sightings of right whales in the North Atlantic, and you can see heavily focused here with a few sightings up in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, a few smatterings elsewhere. But one of the more simple things, without knowing individuals, we wouldn't know, are these all the same whales? And we do know that these are the same whales going up and down the coast, and in fact, all the sightings in these far-off places also, except for one, have matched whales that we've been seeing here. So we know that it's all just one population. We've learned at what age whales can live, at least to a minimum. And this is the first of the really interesting stories. Whale 1045, this is actually a photograph from Motorboat and Sailing from 1935. And it captures an event. It's actually the last right whale killed intentionally in U.S. waters. This is whale 1045, and here, you can't really see it well, is her newborn calf. And fishermen went out and decided they wanted to kill the calf. They harpooned the calf and shot the calf and the mother repeatedly with rifle shot. And after six hours, eventually that calf died. And it wasn't until the calf died that the mother moved on. That mother actually survived and was seen sporadically. She was seen in 1959. 1980. Really, the most of the research started happening in 1980, so these sightings earlier on are just coincidental, or researchers who started the work without really knowing that you could identify the individuals. Then she was seen in 85, 92, and then she was last seen in 1995. So that's 60 years between her first sighting and her last. At her first sighting, she was clearly an adult, so we know that she was at least 10 years old. I'll tell you that in a minute. Probably quite a bit older, because back in 1935 she had quite a bit of scars on her. So she may have been an older female. We have no idea how much older. Unfortunately, this is a very deep gash from a propeller, a very large propeller. So at her last sighting, when she was at least 70, she had a fatal injury. We never were able to recover the body, but we know that she couldn't have survived that. There's no way to age a free-swimming whale. And there's been no really reliable way yet to age even a dead whale, a dead right whale. They have been able to age fin whales. They have a waxy plug in their ear. And fin whales, we believe, can live to 90, 95. And the really interesting story is the bowhead whales. Another way that you can age baleen whales is by analyzing their eyes if you have a really fresh eyeball. And this technique seemed to work for humpbacks and some other species, so they tried on bowhead whales. And they got this immature male that was supposedly, I think, 25 or 26 years old. And most other whales, large whales, reach sexual maturity by around 10, some earlier. So they said, well, that doesn't work, and they tossed out the eyeball. Well, then just a few years later, they found another whale, and it had an ancient stone harpoon tip buried deep inside it. And that type of tip hadn't been used since the mid-1800s. Since then, they found more. So they think that bowhead whales may live to be 150 or 200 years. We don't think that for right whales. We think it'll be more like 90 or 100 years, but we really have no way of knowing yet. Those of you who are alive in 100 years, come back and we'll let you know.
I'm being well past dead.
This is our second oldest whale and one that's still alive, so we'd like to have some positive news. This whale, 1047, was first seen off the coast of Florida in 1957. and then it was last seen in 2009, also off the coast of Florida. So at that point, this whale was at least 53 years old. And so we're going to be keeping an eye on him. And again, just to orient you, because some people think that right whales spawn the myth of sea monsters because they're so bizarre looking, especially when they're feeding at the surface. So this is a whale swimming from the right to the left, and this is just the upper jaw, and these are all the plates of baleen hanging down. By the way, if you have questions at any time, join in, because if you wait till the end, you'll forget them. We've also learned a lot about reproduction by knowing the individuals. We've had 122 females born into the population since we've started doing this. And exactly half of them have reached sexual maturity and gone on to give birth to their own calves. So that's a lot of new females and a lot of age information on when they can give birth. On average, they give birth at 10 years, and this is whale 2301 with her newborn calf at exactly 10 years old. But there's quite a bit of range of when those first calving events happen. One whale gave birth when she was only 5. And another one gave birth when she was 21, although we may have missed some calvings in between. But so there's a large span. We think that females probably give birth throughout their life. That's at least what the whaling data has shown us for other species like fin whales and humpback whales. That 90-year-old female, I think, the fin whale, I think actually had a fetus inside. So we don't have that range yet for right whales, but we have some pretty amazing data about how long a female can give birth and really what that means. Baldy is a wonderful example of this. In 2009, Baldy was seen, this is Baldy, 1240, with her 8th calf. That same year, her daughter from 1985, Trilogy, was seen with her 4th calf. And that same year, Baldy's granddaughter, Boomerang, was seen with her 2nd calf. So in that year, Baldy was a new mother, a new grandmother, and a new great-grandmother. And she was responsible for at least 21 whales being born into the population. So the females are incredibly important. And who knows, we'll keep an eye on Baldy and see how much longer that goes. The importance of these females was really highlighted, again, during a mortality event in 2004 and 2005. In a 14-month period, we lost 8 right whales. 6 of those were females, and 3 of those females actually had fetuses inside of them. So it was a huge blow to the population, and we knew that things hadn't been going well for right whales before then, but this really got us frightened. And we actually all got together, all the scientists who do this work, and we published an article in Science saying, we got to do something. This whale, 1909, was one of those females that died during that time. She was hit by a ship off the mid-Atlantic, and she did have a fetus inside of her. And it's a very powerful display, actually, at the New Bedford Whaling Museum down in New Bedford, Massachusetts, with the 2 of them, the mother and the fetus, their skeletons in the lobby there. I did a back of the envelope calculation about really what this meant. If those 6 females that died, if they all could give birth to 8 calves at a minimum, and half of those calves were female, which we would guess because that's roughly what the population is, what was the final calculation? It was a loss of 240 whales over just 2 generations from this one 14-month period of mortality. So we have to protect the females. And they're one of the more vulnerable members of the population because they're going down to the southeast. The whole eastern seaboard is thick with ships. And down there are military bases, there's a lot. So they're sort of running a gauntlet going up and down the coast. Also, by knowing individuals, we know just the basic thing of how many animals are born each year. So this is from 1980 to 2011. we've had as low as 1 right whale born in the year 2000, and as many as 39 born in 2009. You expect sort of variation in small populations, but some of the variation here, and here is extreme, and we think something happened more than just random variation during those time periods. And the best guess, actually, especially here, is food limitation. A lot of the animals were thin. Many of them also showed signs of some sort of disease, and we don't know which or both were involved in this reproductive decline. We've also learned how long whales nurse their calves. With all these events of calving, we've seen many mothers and calves, and we know that for the most part they'll wean their calf by the end of their first year. One thing we didn't know was how young they could wean their calves, and we learned this with another pretty amazing story. And this, you'll notice a number of these stories are not researchers who are going out and collecting the information. It's just an accident that we have this detail. And it's amazing that we've been able to piece together what we know. These are photographs from a father and his son who were out fishing in the Bay of Fundy, up between Maine and Nova Scotia. And they saw a couple whales, and the dad took out his photograph, started taking pictures. And while he did so, the larger whales started thrashing and throwing up these huge sheets of water. And then it rolled over and stopped breathing. And he actually witnessed the death of Delilah, who was there with her first calf. So the small whale was a calf. Later on, Delilah's body washed up on shore, and we were able to do an animal autopsy and discern that she had been hit by a ship, but she had lived through that, but she had internal bleeding and eventually hemorrhage, and that's what they saw. So the calf at that point was 8 or 9 months old, and we had no idea if it could survive, and we were frantically combing the Bay of Fundy looking for the calf or maybe a body. Luckily, it did survive. It was seen a couple years later, and so we decided to name it Calvin, after the cartoon character, because this was a precocious whale who could survive at a young age. It was sort of the thinking. And of course, you know, the next year we found out Calvin was a female, so doesn't quite fit as well, but still a good name. And Calvin has gone on to give birth to her own calves. And she's also a member of, we have a sponsorship program at the aquarium, and if you're interested, there are brochures out there, and Calvin is one of our sponsored whales. So now I'm going to start getting into the interesting stories about what we don't know. And first I have to explain this very esoteric cartoon. This was a researcher. These are different callosity patterns hanging up in this calf's closet. And this is the mother offering broken no islands to the calf. And the calf is horrified. No, Ma, please don't make me wear broken no islands again. Definitely obscure. Oh, and these are lip callosities. Got a little box of lip callosities. So I have the word decision up there because everything we see whales do, to me it's a decision that they're making. You know, who they are traveling with, where they go, and each one of those decisions actually tell us something about what they need. There are a lot of scientists who don't like to use the word decision when dealing with animals because it sort of implies a certain level of cognition that we don't know whether or not they have. I sort of sweep that aside for now. You know, regardless of the terminology, it's definitely showing us, they are showing us through their actions what's important to them. And what they show us is often unexpected. So this is whale 2010. So a 10-year-old male who was seen in Florida on January 12th in the year 2000. 11 days later, it was seen up in Cape Cod Bay. Well, we always thought the whales went south during the winter. Well, maybe 2010 realized that. Oops, turned around 23 days later, back down off of Georgia. 23 days after that, back up in Cape Cod. So that's, what's that?
He just likes New England.
That's right. Torn between, you know, the nice winters. So this is This was 3,000 miles of traveling over a few months. I forget if I've told you, but they don't feed down there. There's really no food in the water. So that's telling us something. Unfortunately, we don't know exactly what it's telling us yet. But that male was saying, you know, it's not just about the food up north. And it may be, you know, one thought could be because this was during the winter months, is when they should be getting pregnant. Maybe he was looking for mates. But the southeast is not the best place because those are mothers who've just given birth, and they only can give birth every 3 years at the earliest. So none of those females are going to be ready to conceive. I think, and this will be something I'll sort of be talking about periodically, that there could be some social component that we don't really understand that's important to that animal and is generating that level of interest. So that's a decision by an adult male. Now I'll tell you about a couple decisions by females with their calves. This is a whale named Duracia. It's a whale we don't know much about as far as her history. She just showed up in the population in 1993. We didn't know who her mother or father was. But then in 2004, she gave birth to her first calf. And she was seen off of here, like all the other females who give birth to calves. But then she was seen down off Miami, and then shortly after that, she was seen in the Gulf of Mexico. And there are very few, but very few historic records of right whales in the Gulf of Mexico. So that made us scratch our heads. One thought, certainly I had, was, well, we don't know anything about her history. So maybe her mother took her into the Gulf of Mexico, and she just is going where her mother took her. We do know that right whales show site fidelity to where their mothers took them as far as the feeding ground. So a female who's born to a mother, when she eventually grows up and gives birth to her first calves, she'll go to the same places the mother did to feed. But we don't know that about calving. So that was one thought. That thought was weakened, however, when 2 years later, Boomerang, and Boomerang, if you remember, was Baldy's granddaughter. And we know a lot about Boomerang's history. We know her mother is, her grandmother is. Nobody that we know of has done something like this. So it may be memory in some cases. In some cases, it could be exploring. Or maybe there's some information we don't know about that makes a whale like Boomerang take her calf into a really, Corpus Christi, Texas, not a nice place to take your calf. Just as a little aside, Duracia continued to be a really unusual whale. She continues to be. She gave birth to her second calf off of Cape Cod in May or June, which she didn't read the memo. That's not what she was supposed to do. And then, you know, right whales, we think, are actually intolerant to warm water. They're able to handle cold water, but they can't dump the heat. So we think there's sort of a temperature gradient which they avoid. She didn't get that memo. She took her calf in July down to Florida. And they happened to be having a fishing derby, and some folks took a photograph of this odd thing swimming by, and we were able to identify it to Duracia. And then the other thing that makes her noteworthy is she just gave birth a few years ago to her third calf, and it was the second time in the history that right whale had been seen giving birth. So this is Duracia with her calf, who's literally minutes old, and you can actually see blood plumes as she gets rid of the afterbirth. And up here, I don't know if you can tell from back there, but they're dark patches. They were sort of swimming in circles. Yeah, it's amazing. Amazing to see. Okay, so now the next story is about an adult male. You know, our first adult male did something unexpected, but in habitats that we know about. This whale named Porter, is an old male who was seen, I think it's May 1999. Let me just check that. Yeah, May 1999 off of Cape Cod. And then this is him in September. Pretty hilly. Any guesses?
Coast of Maine, possibly Nova Scotia?
That would be something we would expect, Maine or Nova Scotia. Well, it's the northernmost fjord of Norway. So, again, he didn't get the memo either. Nobody's been reading the memos. We don't actually know what path he took.
Maybe he was
but
working for the Navy.
This is 3,600 miles, and he was seen back down in Cape Cod the next spring. So this wasn't just, I'm going to take off for a few years. That was one of the things that's really interesting about a number of these unusual behaviors is, I showed you there's some animals that disappear for 10, 15, 17 years. Now that, you could think, oh, they went off to Norway, put some time, But this guy, we would never have guessed this if it wasn't for the lucky coincidence that someone took photographs of him up here. So again, why? The best guess is this is someplace that he was taken as a calf. And there have been years where feeding has been really poor in the areas which they normally feed. So if it's true that this is sort of a cultural memory that he has, it gives us some hope because there may be other areas out there that this small population has lost the memory of, except for a few of these really old animals. I don't know if you know, like female elephants are really important. The long-lived ones can know where the water will be found 50 years later when there's a drought. So there could be something like this going on in right whales. Again, a lot of this is speculation, but it's fun to sort of speculate.
How do you know what route he took?
How do we know what route he took? No, we don't know at all. This is just totally guessing. I just did a straight line until I hit something. But one thing that's actually interesting, I don't know if you've heard on NPR recently, they did something about humpback whales and talking about how they go a straight line and they do not vary. They do something that is very hard for us to do. So what path he took, I don't know. But hearing that about the humpbacks taking such straight lines, wild animals do not waste their energy. I do a little animal tracking during the winter, and you can always tell a dog versus a coyote, because the dog, is well-fed. Oh, check this out, check that out. A coyote is like, So this is not a vacation. This whale, this is important, what this whale did. Again, we just don't know what that is.
How did you acquire the chance photograph?
That's actually a good question. How did we acquire the chance photograph? Luckily, it seems that these odd photographs, someone will give it to somebody who studies fish that they know, and that person will know somebody who studies seals, and eventually it gets up to somebody who knows sort of the common denominator. And it was at a conference, and they know that the aquarium does right whale research. So it was through a whale researcher in Norway. And I don't remember actually how many steps before it got to him. Do you?
Because I met him and he said that he was visiting his grandmother who lived on this fjord. And somebody at the hardware store, before he got on the boat, told him there was a whale in the fjord. And he said, really? So he went out, he happened to get out in the boat and go.
Did everybody hear that? Perfect. It's perfect.
Why don't you tag them?
It's a good question. We have tried tagging them with satellite tags. We've had over 100 right whales tagged. They're very, very tactile, like more tactile than most of the large whales. So they're always rubbing against each other and rubbing. And you have to have an antenna that's sticking out. And now they've learned that the only way to really have the attachment work is to actually go into the muscle. So go through 12 inches of blubber with razor point steel tips into the muscle. And of all those tagging events, the longest that we got anything broadcast was 6 months, and the next longest was a matter of weeks. So we didn't get much information, and it left some pretty nasty swelling. So but it is extraordinary that we're getting this level of information without it. Whenever I give talks, if there's an engineer, and I don't mean to malign engineers, but if there's an engineer in the crowd, they're always like, just tag them all, and tell the ships where they are, and good technological fix, but not that easy.
Is that something that some other parallel group is working on?
Tagging?
Trying to figure out a way to tag these whales?
A little bit less so with right whales. They continue to do it with other whales. I think they've really been put off by the whole problem with the rubbing. Yeah, so that's sort of, and the fact that these are such an endangered species, when you start seeing large swellings and things. And one of my issues with it personally is that when we were doing, or people were doing this work, you know, what really are you going to gain? People were saying, we need to know where they go so we can protect those habitats. Well, frankly, we're having trouble figuring out how to protect the habitats we know that they're in. So I just don't, I personally don't buy that. If we find tools to protect these habitats and they work, then that's really something we can talk about. So this is going to be a decision about an adult female made, but one without a calf. So what do females decide to do in between calvings? This was actually a female who had never calved before. She was seen up in the Bay of Fundy in September. And then in January, this is her with an island in the background, and that's Pico Island in the Azores. Again, didn't read the memo. So, and this way, I guess she went to the continental shelf and then took a change, but I don't know. So the things I think really interesting about this decision, there are a couple things. One, in general, it's been thought for right whales and humpback whales that they generally go north-south, and the whales that are seen off of here, like there was a calving ground historically in Sintra Bay off of Africa. And it was believed that those animals came up and down the coast, and so they were the first ones to be hunted by the Basque and were hunted off of Scotland and Ireland. And then the western stock does this sort of thing. Like humpbacks that give birth here go up to Norway. So there's sort of a diagonal thing, but it was always thought that this stock, for both right whales and humpback whales, were probably separate. So going east-west was really a surprise. The other thing that was a surprise is she did this in January. So that's the peak calving time. So that makes you scratch your head. There have been 5 females who have gone down to the calving ground the year before they gave birth, almost as if they're just sort of sussing things out. And so I got all excited. I'd like to go out on a limb now and again. And I thought, well, maybe she's going to check out a new calving ground. Maybe this is, because we don't know where Pico was born. We don't know who her mother is. She was another one that we just saw as a young whale show up. So I got all excited and thought, well, maybe this is a calving ground. Maybe she's even going over here to Sintra Bay where there was a calving ground. And we'll see her the next year. We'll do all the surveys in the southeast. She won't show up, and then we'll see her up in the Bay of Fundy with a calf, and I'll be right. But that didn't happen. She was not seen the next year with a calf, but actually just a couple months ago she was seen down in Florida, and she was seen before she gave birth and after she gave birth, so she definitely gave birth down in Florida. So what she was doing there, again, it could be some cultural transmission of information. She was the second right whale to be seen in the Azores in 120 years, so it's really unique. And the last story is, before I go on to a little bit about behaviors, is this is whale 1334, and I don't know if it's too dark. It's a beautiful photograph of this whale underwater. And she's interesting because she has given birth to 8 calves, but we never see her anyplace else. There have been like 1 or 2 sightings off of Cape Cod and 1 sighting up in the Labrador Basin just south of Greenland. But basically, we don't see her. The only reason that we know this whale exists is because she has to use one of the 5 habitats that we survey. Now, if she were a male, we'd never see her. So it gives you some indication that this is another hole in our database. We know that there's some animals out there that we're not keeping tabs on at all. And this was really supported recently when the geneticists who we work with started looking at paternities. Behaviorally, you don't know who the fathers are, but if you have a genetic sample from the mom and a genetic sample from the calf, you can figure out exactly what the genetic profile of the dad should be. And we thought, we have 85% of all the whales sampled. We have skin samples from them. So we thought, oh, we're going to get lots of fathers lined up with these calves, and only about 30% of them could we attribute fathers to. So from that, with a little bit of math, we figured out that there were at least 30 to 40 males out there that we've never even photographed. So if there are that many males, there could be an equal number of females. So that gives us a little bit of hope as we see whales getting killed. And one thing I forgot to mention, that this whole death thing is ongoing. In the last 5 months, we actually have had a really bad run with right whales. There were 6 ship strikes in the last 5 months. 1 was fatal, and 2 we think are going to end up being fatal, really bad wounds. And there are 7 new entanglements, 2 of which were fatal. So it's they're really being hit out there.
Do they get hit more than other whales?
That's a good question. The question was whether or not they get hit by more than other whales. I don't actually know the answer. One thing is they float more, so I think we detect them more. There's a lot more energy put into determining cause of death with a right whale. So we're actually, if you see a whale floating at sea, another species, just a whale floating at sea, no one will know what killed it. So, I mean, I don't know if you have any thoughts about that, Amy, about...
We did do an analysis of worldwide ship strikes, and did find that right whales per capita were more frequently struck than other large whales.
But that could be somewhat biased.
And fin whales were the most frequently struck.
Fin whales, yeah.
It could be their near coastal habits,
right.
Slow swimming.
Are they slower swimming?
Yeah, they are slow swimming. Yeah. This is just a nice slide. This is where we do our research in the Bay of Fundy, and this one year where right whales were very close towards shore, which they're generally not up there. So there are a couple things that were interesting about all those stories I told you. One is that all of those animals were seen regularly. You know, Porter and Pico, even 1334, who we don't see for a couple of years, but we see her every 3 years when she gives birth. And they all were doing really interesting, unexpected things. So we would have expected that of the animals we're not seeing much of. All those stories mostly had to do with movements. And now I'm just going to go into a few of the behaviors that we typically see in right whales that are really interesting and not fully understood. We've talked about how mothers generally wean their calves by the end of the first year. This is actually a mother with a yearling who she kept well into the second year. This has been rare historically. In the first 20 years of our work, there were roughly 200 calves born, and only 4 of those calves stayed with their mothers into the second year. Then this really changed in the early 2000s. With about 100 calves born, 21 mother-yearling pairs were seen. So we really started trying to figure out why. That's a pretty important decision. A female actually loses 1/3 of her body weight in the first year nursing a calf. So to extend that time, assuming she's nursing into that second year, that's a big decision. So one thought is that a female will, if she's robust enough, she can handle it, she'll nurse her calf for longer, and that will give her calf a competitive advantage going forward. That calf will be bigger, it will find more food, it'll be more attractive for mates, whatever. So there may be some of that, but the problem is that most of these females took their calves back down to the southeast. So if you wanted to just nurse your calf for longer and you've already lost 1/3 of your body weight, you'd stay up north where you can feed. These animals were going down to the southeast. It's a really messy picture that we don't understand. One of the things that was interesting as we looked at this, we discovered that it was inexperienced females that did it. So it was females who had only either never had a calf before or just had one calf before. And that was irrespective of their age. So it wasn't an age thing, it was just whether or not they'd given birth before. And we know that other mammals, their first calf or two, they're often smaller. So maybe they were putting more into smaller calves, but not just physiologically with the nursing, but also now the southeast has become a really big social habitat. It's not just a calving ground. We see now 80% of all the 1, 2, 3-year-old whales go down to the southeast and don't eat, roll around, lots of physical contact, and they spend months not eating. So again, I think there's a social component that's really important that we don't understand with these animals. And part of the reason that we don't understand it is because whales, they're acoustic animals. So right now we say a whale is associated if we see it swimming together at the surface. And in the case of, the toothed whales like killer whales, you see this coordinated behavior you can witness obviously. But right whales can communicate across tens of miles. And if you have whales that are traveling together, let's say searching for food, they're sort of fanned out, we don't know that. We just think those are individual whales. But I think there's more of that going on in this population, and we just haven't quite figured it out.
Now, are right whales more of a potting species, or?
A potting species? No, I mean, that's just it. They're considered, all the baleen whales are considered solitary, basically. You see mothers and calves are sort of a real association that stays. And then otherwise, they come together, but in areas where there's food. So you don't see a cohesive social unit, which would be a pod. But again, there may be one, but we're not detecting it.
Right.
Another interesting behavior is the surface active group, or SAG. This is a female belly up with males on either side clasping her. I'm going to show you a video of this in just a second. It's a really interesting behavior. We see penises in the air. We know that it does have some reproductive function, but
Might just be fun.
might just be fun because they do it year-round. They do it in every habitat. They do it when they're juveniles. They'll do all males, all females. So there's another component, and it may be sort of assessing each other's social bonds. So I'm going to show this clip, and I'll put the cursor, I'll put the pointer on the female, just to give you a sense of what's going on here. Is that loud enough? So here's the female. This can be a group of 2. I think this group is 30. We're desperately trying to figure out who's who we need a genetic sample from. There's the female, a male clasping her. Whale named Toothbrush. There's the female. You can always pick her out because she's the focus of everything.
Are they bigger in the white whale? Are the females bigger in the white whale?
Yeah, in the baleen whales, the females are larger than the males. There's the female with the male on either side clasping her. So females call in males. If you put in an underwater microphone, you can hear her calling continuously, and you see males coming from miles and miles racing in. And you can have groups of, we had a group of 45 animals. And we identified pretty much everybody, and it was one female in the middle, I think it was actually 43 males, and then there was one female sort of around the periphery. Not quite sure what she was doing.
Taking notes.
That's right. That's a little too much for me. It's a really interesting behavior. Another thing that happens in these SAGs is that the males actually, who are found in them, tend to be more related to each other than you would expect by random. So there's some sort of sorting going on. Now, what does the actual conception look like? Because these things are happening, again, often during times when they can't be conceiving, because they're giving birth during the winter, and we think their gestation is 12 to 13 months. So does the group look different when they're actually conceiving their young? Well, we didn't know the answer to that, and we still don't, but we're getting closer, because this area just west of Jordan Basin was discovered in the last few years to be the likely mating ground. A plane doing surveys repeatedly over the years there have found in November, December, and January large concentrations of right whales and females who are seen 12 months later with a calf. So the data are pretty compelling. But we only had aerial data from that area, and we really wanted to get some shipboard data. Some of the things that would be great to get, feces from that area to see what the hormonal levels are in both the males and the females. That would be another really clear indication of what their sexual activity is there. And also, I'm really curious to see what those sags look like from the water. You know, if there's a qualitative difference that you can tell between conception and non-conception. So we actually went out there this winter for the first time, our group and the Canadian Whale Institute. And unfortunately, there were not many whales out there this year, so we didn't see a single one of those mating type groups. And having come from our field season up in the Bay of Fundy last September, August and September, was also really sparse whale-wise. And it seemed like whales were coming in and then going out, like they were searching. So it doesn't bode well. Many of us have a hunch that calving is going to be really low next year. And it was really the wrong year to start looking at the mating ground. This is one of my favorite behaviors. This is a whale doing a head push. Its head coming out and pushing down. And when it does it, it makes this sound. Really loud. So those of you who are sleeping, I'll do that again. That's called a gunshot. And it's made internally. We don't know how. If you're very close to the whale, you'll see their body sort of jiggle like jello. And we don't know really what they're doing with it. The first time we heard it was in courtship groups, in those sags, with another courtship, we don't know. But now we see it frequently in the Bay of Fundy with lone males, and they're always far away from the concentration. And you know, one obvious guess would be that they're actually making a sound to say to the females, "Look how big I am." You can hear how big I am. But wouldn't you do that near a female? You know, I mean, it's suspicious. And the other thing that's interesting is they often do it in the Bay of Fundy. Maybe we'll have a group of 20 or 30 whales in the middle. They'll either be way 10 miles to the west, or 10 miles to the east, or 10 miles to the south. They're really, it's almost like they create an acoustic perimeter around the pod. The other thing that's interesting is it could be warning other males away, say, "Stay away, I'm big." But males come on over, and the next thing you'll see is two males doing this together. And what you'll hear is we actually have a microphone underwater, and it's plugged into the video camera. So it's not great video, but you'll hear gunshots. Gunshots.
And you don't know what part of that body is doing.
No. No, people are really, they're trying to figure it out, but whether or not it's moving air in a certain way. It's a really, because it's so percussive. So I love the mystery of that sound. And actually, there's someone who has been making recordings out on Jordan Basin, and she anecdotally said it's like almost all gunshots. So one of the next things we're going to do is be comparing what are the levels of gunshots in that area, that time of year versus other areas, and that may...
Boys only, right?
What's that?
Males only.
Well, they've got to have some females out there if it's a mating ground.
No, but to make the gunshots.
Oh yes, only males. Only males. And just the very last behavior, very briefly, this is two whales at the surface feeding. But you'll see they're coordinating their feeding, and they'll be making turns together. It's called Shalon Feeding, just the way geese fly. And again, this is an interesting decision. You know, why do they do that? One thought would be that they're related, and you know, you're basically the lead whale's taking the brunt, supposedly. You know, with geese, that's the harder position to fly in. We don't know if there's any hydrodynamic effect. The best guess is that there's sort of eddies of concentrated plankton that come off the bow wake of this whale. It might concentrate a little bit in the mouth of the other whale. But so far we haven't seen any indication of relationship or age. It's not always the bigger whale that's in the front. So this is another one of the wonderful mysteries, and we'll be hopefully exploring more. And I think I'm going to run out of time with that. So that's where I'll stop. Thanks very much for your... Yeah.